Most global teams think the hard part is translation. It isn't. The hard part starts after the words land, because that's where tone, hesitation, status, and polite resistance get flattened into something that looks clear but isn't. A meeting ends, the transcript looks clean, the recap sounds organized, and everyone leaves with a different read on what just happened. That's expensive. Miscommunication costs businesses about $1.2 trillion every year. And when you look at why outsourcing projects fail, 60% of those failures link back to cultural incompatibility, while 56% stem from communication breakdowns. This episode isn't about getting better subtitles or faster translations. It's about something deeper. How do you recover intent in meetings where people don't say everything directly and where the real signal sits between the lines? That's the shift, and Teams Premium already gives you more of that signal than most teams know how to use. The invisible wall in global business. Most meeting systems still run on an old model. Language goes in, words come out, a transcript gets stored, a summary gets shared, everyone assumes the meeting is now understood because the content was captured. But that model only works when communication is mostly explicit, direct, and verbalized in full. In a lot of global business settings, it isn't. High-context communication doesn't put the whole message in the sentence. Part of the message sits in timing, in softness, in what gets delayed, and in what never gets stated at all. One person hears, "We should revisit this next quarter," and logs that as a neutral planning note, while another person hears caution, loss of confidence, and a polite refusal to commit. Same words, different meeting. That's where things break. In more direct cultures, disagreement usually arrives in the words themselves. Someone says no, they push back, they call out the risk. In higher context settings, disagreement often shows up in a softer form. The answer gets deferred, ownership gets broadened, the language gets warmer, while the commitment gets weaker. If you only track literal wording, you miss the decision signal completely. And that's not a cultural theory problem, it's an operating problem. This is where rework starts. A team thinks approval happened, so execution moves forward. Then an objection appears later from someone who never felt safe saying no in the room. A vendor might hear tentative agreement and start planning capacity, while the client thought they were only being courteous, or a technical team reads, "That should be possible," as commitment when it was really uncertainty wrapped in politeness. Nobody lied, but the meeting still failed. The numbers behind that failure are staggering. Large firms lose an average of $62.4 million a year to poor communication, and even smaller firms lose about $420,000 for every 1,000 employees they have. In the world of global outsourcing, 62% of projects run over budget. When you look at those numbers through the meeting lens, the pattern gets pretty clear. A lot of cost doesn't come from bad strategy. It comes from meetings that produced apparent alignment instead of real alignment. Remote work made this worse. In a physical room, people often repair misunderstanding informally. You catch someone after the meeting. You read the pause. You notice who stayed quiet when the decision landed. In a digital meeting, especially a multilingual one, that repair layer gets thinner. People rely more on captions, transcripts, AI notes, and recaps because those are the artifacts everyone can share. But those artifacts mostly preserve what was said, not always what was meant. So the problem isn't just the language barrier, it's the model behind it. We built meeting habits around the idea that if we capture the words, we capture the meeting. In global work, that assumption breaks fast. And once you see that, a bigger question shows up. If translation solved understanding, why do misunderstandings keep scaling with better tools anyway? Why translation isn't enough? Word accuracy and meaning accuracy are not the same thing. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud, but most meeting workflows still treat them like the same outcome. If the captions look clean, if the transcript reads well, and if everyone can technically follow the language, teams assume the meeting worked. That assumption fails the moment communication depends on context more than wording. Low context communication is easier here. People state the point, they name the risk, they ask the hard question directly, and they tie decisions to clear language. AI handles that kind of exchange pretty well. Deadlines, specifications, delivery dates, budget numbers, explicit approvals, that's all much closer to structured data, so translation tools can carry it across languages with far less loss. High context communication works differently because part of the message lives in relationship management, hierarchy, timing, and what a person chooses not to say in front of others. Someone says, "That may be difficult for us this quarter," and a literal translation can be perfect while the intended meaning still gets missed. Was that a scheduling note, a negotiation move, a polite refusal, a warning that internal support doesn't exist? The words alone don't settle it. This clicked for me when I stopped asking, "Did the tool translate the sentence right?" and started asking, "What job was that sentence doing in the meeting?" That's the real question. In some meetings, language transfers information. In others, it protects status, avoids embarrassment, buys time, softens disagreement, or keeps the relationship intact while signaling resistance. If you don't read that layer, you don't really understand the exchange. And this is where literal translation still earns its place. You should absolutely use it for the parts of the meeting that need precision. Technical requirements, contract terms, milestones, support processes, Clear decisions that need to travel fast across teams. That part matters. The mistake is expecting the same tool to fully decode negotiation posture, face-saving language, soft nose, or relational signals that only make sense inside a specific cultural pattern. The current performance data backs that up. In structured meeting conditions, transcript accuracy can reach the low to mid-90s. But when you move from transcription into sentiment and emotion, reliability drops into lower bands in real production settings. And then things get messier. Sarcasm throws it off. Indirect criticism throws it off. Slang throws it off. People switching between languages mid-thought throws it off. So when teams treat AI interpretation as settled fact, they start automating uncertainty. There's another limit you need to keep in mind. As of the 2026 roadmap information in your research set, there's no confirmed Teams premium path for broad nonverbal cue interpretation across meetings. No magic layer that watches facial expressions, reads posture, and tells you who secretly disagreed. So don't build a meeting model around features that don't exist. Use the model that does exist. AI is good at surfacing traces, patterns, inconsistencies, missing owners, repeated defer language, gaps between what sounded settled live and what still looks vague after the meeting. That's useful, very useful actually, but it's a signal layer, not a truth machine. Once you treat it that way, the whole posture changes. You stop asking the tool to read the room for you, and you start using it to show you where to look more closely. So what can Teams Premium do well right now? What Teams Premium actually changes? Teams Premium matters when you stop treating it like a translation add-on and start treating it like a context recovery layer. That's the shift. It doesn't solve culture. It doesn't decode motive by itself. What it does is reduce friction in the live meeting, then give you better post-meeting material to inspect where intent may have slipped. Start with live translation and interpreter. Their value is obvious at one level. People can follow the conversation in their preferred language, which lowers exclusion fast. But the deeper gain is meeting flow. When language access improves, people interrupt less, ask for fewer resets, and spend less energy just trying to keep up. Consecutive interpretation matters here because it slows the exchange into clearer turns. In high-stakes multilingual meetings, that structure helps. People hear a full statement, then the interpretation follows, and the meeting becomes easier to track without constant overlap. That doesn't mean the interpretation captures every layer of meaning. It means more people can stay in the conversation long enough to notice where meaning may still need checking. Access first, interpretation second, judgment after that. Then there's intelligent recap, and this is where the real operating change starts. Not because summaries are new, they aren't, but because recap gives you a second pass through the meeting with structure built in. You get AI notes, tasks, speaker-attributed moments, chapters, and personalized catch-up. If someone missed the meeting, they don't need to hunt through an hour of recording. They can get back to the right point fast. If someone joined live but sensed something felt off, they can review the output without relying on memory alone. That second pass matters more than most teams realize, because ambiguity often becomes visible after the meeting, not during it. In the room, people are processing language, watching time, managing slides, and deciding when to speak. After the meeting, the noise drops. Now you can scan for weak commitments. You can spot action items that sound active but don't name an owner. You can catch a decision that appears in the summary even though no approver was clearly identified. You can notice language patterns like "we should revisit," "let's align offline," or "this may require further discussion," showing up again and again around the same issue. That's not sentiment analysis in the magical sense. It's better evidence handling. And the practical payoff is already pretty clear in your source set. Intelligent recap has been tied to stronger action item follow-through than manual notes, and it also cuts the time needed to catch up after a missed meeting. Those are direct operating gains, but the more strategic gain is this. Recap helps you inspect whether the meeting produced actual commitment or just well-worded ambiguity. There's also a trust layer people often miss. Custom dictionaries and domain language support matter a lot in technical, legal, and industry-heavy conversations. If your meeting uses product names, acronyms, regulatory terms, or client-specific vocabulary, cleaner recognition changes how seriously people take the output. Once terminology lands correctly, the recap becomes more usable, and people spend less time arguing with the system before they can even analyze the discussion. Still, keep the limit in view. Teams Premium does not read faces. It does not infer hidden cultural rules on its own. It does not tell you whether a soft answer meant respect, hesitation, or rejection. What it gives you is a stronger trace of the meeting with better capture, better attribution, and better review paths. That's enough to improve judgment if your team knows how to read the output, so the value isn't the feature list. It's what those features let you notice that you would have missed before. A better meeting model, from raw transcript to intent review. You need a different meeting model. I'm not talking about a better way to take notes or a new habit for recaps. I mean a different model entirely. This approach assumes that your first pass through a meeting is just for capturing content, while the second pass is where you actually check for intent. You listen once to hear what people said, and then you review it again to see what the meeting was actually trying to achieve. That small shift changes everything because it stops the transcript from being a final record and turns it into the starting point for real analysis. The first move is simple, but you have to capture the meeting properly. Turn on the transcription and make sure the language settings actually match the people who are speaking. If you need translation, you should enable it before the conversation starts rather than waiting until halfway through when everyone is already confused. If your team uses specialized terms or industry jargon, take a moment to load the custom dictionary. This part sounds basic, but bad data capture will poison every step that follows. When names and technical terms are wrong, your review starts with noise and people will lose trust in the output before they even get to the important parts. Once the meeting ends, don't just open the recap to skim the summary for things you missed. Open it to inspect the gaps. That is the fundamental difference between how most people work and how high-performing teams operate. Most people use a recap for convenience, but smart teams use it as a diagnostic tool to find out what went wrong. Look at the tasks and ask a much harder question than whether or not action items were listed. You need to ask if this meeting actually created accountable action, because those two things are not the same. A task can exist on paper and still be completely weak. A note like follow up on pricing sounds fine until you realize there is no owner, no deadline, and no specific decision point attached to it. After you check the tasks, compare the language of commitment with the phrasing around it. This is the part where most people move way too fast. They see a line that sounds positive and they treat it like the matter is closed. You need to slow down and read the lines right next to it. Did the speaker commit to the work directly, or did they try to shift the responsibility onto the group? There is a massive difference between someone saying they will send a revised scope by Tuesday and someone saying the team can probably get something over soon. Those two statements live in very different risk categories, even if a standard recap makes them both look like usable information. You should also pay close attention to delegation patterns because that is usually where uncertainty hides. A person who actually owns a decision sounds very different from a person who is just managing around the edges of it. You will start to notice phrases like, "we need to check internally," or "let us circle back after we align." That might be a normal part of your process, but it could also mean the person in the room didn't have the authority to make a call in the first place. If the summary shows a path forward, but the language keeps moving away from a single accountable person, you should treat that as a major signal rather than a footnote. From there, you need to tag the specific moments that carry extra risk for the project. Not every vague sentence matters, but some of them can be incredibly expensive. The ones you need to watch for are polite agreements that don't have deadlines and technical confidence that doesn't include a dependency check. You should also look for decisions that seem finished, even though the person who needs to approve them never actually spoke clearly. These are the moments that generate expensive follow-up meetings later because everyone leaves the room with a different interpretation and nobody notices the problem until the delivery date slips. Then you have to close the loop while the context is still fresh in everyone's mind. Don't send out a giant recap email that just repeats everything that happened during the hour. Instead, send a short follow-up that specifically tests the meaning of what was said. You should ask if Anna is the final approver for the timeline, or if a mention of internal review means the deal is pending rather than agreed. Ask who will own the next draft and exactly when it will be ready. These questions do a lot more than just clean up your notes. They force hidden ambiguity out into the open while people still remember the actual tone of the exchange. Executives use this kind of review to validate big decisions and judge when they need to escalate a problem. Technical teams use the exact same method to catch fuzzy requirements and assumptions that slipped through because nobody wanted to interrupt the flow of the conversation. It is a different audience, but it is the same discipline. You review the words and then you review the intent behind them. Once that becomes your normal way of working, the meeting stops being something you just store in a folder. It becomes something you actually interpret. Where most organizations still get this wrong. A lot of organizations install the tool, switch on the transcription, and then keep running their meetings the exact same way they always have. That is a massive mistake. The software changes, but the behavior stays stuck in an old model where the only goals are capture and distribution. The recap just becomes a slightly nicer set of notes, and translation becomes a simple convenience layer. The harder question never gets asked, and nobody stops to think about what in the meeting still needs human interpretation. That is exactly where the value gets lost. A recap is not just documentation, it is a diagnostic layer for your business. If your team only uses it to confirm who was there and grab a few tasks, you are getting the lightest possible benefit from a very deep source of information. The point isn't just that a summary exists for you to read. The point is that the summary lets you compare what sounded settled in real time against what looks thin once the conversation is written down. That gap is where almost all of your expensive problems are hiding. Another common failure happens when teams start trusting AI labels and sentiment markers too much. They see a clean transcript and a tidy summary, so they relax and assume everything is fine. But these systems still struggle with indirect speech, sarcasm, and culturally coded restraint. If a meeting felt awkward or ambiguous to you, but the AI output looks perfectly neat, you should not trust the software more than your own gut feeling. That mismatch between the clean summary and your own uncertainty is usually your first warning sign. Then you have to look at how these tools are actually rolled out. Many firms deploy translation features because they are visible and easy to explain to a board, but they skip the part that actually changes business outcomes. They don't create cultural playbooks or review habits for high-risk meetings. They don't assign an owner to check whether an agreement was real or just socially comfortable for the people in the room. In most organizations, the tool arrives much faster than the operating model, and then leadership wonders why the actual business impact is so small. This pattern isn't just limited to your weekly meetings, it is a much wider problem with how we use AI. Research shows that only a small fraction of AI projects actually hit the ROI that teams expected. This usually doesn't happen because the model failed, but because the workflow around the model never changed enough to absorb the value. The same thing happens here. If you drop Teams Premium into a culture that rewards speed over clarity, the output just becomes more content rather than better judgment. That is the big split. Bad use of this technology is just automation for the sake of convenience. Good use is orchestration for the sake of better judgment. In the first case, teams just want the system to save them time and produce some artifacts. In the second case, they use the system to route human attention toward the parts of a meeting that actually need a manual check. One approach reduces your admin work, but the other actually reduces misunderstanding. Those are not the same result, and confusing them is why most adoption plans go flat. The issue isn't whether the software works, the issue is whether your meeting system knows how to handle what the software gives you. The Executive Playbook for 2026 Global Meetings. So what do you actually do with this? The first step is to stop treating Teams Premium like a blanket setting for every call. You need to use it where misreading intent carries a real price. Use it where ambiguity turns into delay, rework, or lost trust. In reality, that means focusing on vendor negotiations, cross-border delivery calls, and steering committees. These are the moments where multiple languages and power structures are in play at the same time, and the cost of a mistake is simply too high. In these high-stakes meetings, polite language often creates the most confusion. People want to protect relationships while they try to move decisions, and that creates a layer of fog. When that happens, a clean AI recap without any human interpretation can give leadership a dangerous sense of false confidence. A better operating rhythm starts before the meeting even begins. You should send a short context brief that outlines who is in the room and what decision is actually needed. Identify who can approve the plan and where disagreement is likely to happen. This doesn't need to be a heavy document, but it needs to make the meeting legible before anyone starts talking. During the meeting, your goal is to capture everything that helps with a later review. Turn the transcription on. Use translation if you need it. If the conversation is likely to get sensitive or layered, use the interpreter flow to support clearer turn-taking. The point is to reduce the noise early so the post-meeting review starts from something you can actually use. Then comes the part most teams skip. You need to run a fast intent review immediately after the meeting. This isn't a giant committee process, but rather a short pass with defined roles. The meeting owner checks whether the stated outcome actually happened, while a recap reviewer scans for vague ownership or soft resistance. An action item validator confirms that every next step has a person, a date, and a decision path attached to it. If the meeting crosses strong cultural lines, you might need a cultural bridge to flag when a polite yes actually means probably not. This sounds formal, but it isn't. It's just disciplined. Once you put that rhythm in place, certain markers become much easier to spot. You'll start seeing agreement without a date or a summary with no clear owner. You'll notice decisions that sound finished but have no named approver. The same phrases will show up again and again, like, "we'll revisit" or "we should align internally." None of those are automatic red flags, but when they cluster together, they usually point to unresolved intent. That's why the best model is hybrid judgment. You let the AI handle the scale, but you let humans handle the interpretation. In low-risk meetings, the recap might be enough on its own. In high-stakes conversations, that recap should trigger better questions rather than replacing them. That split matters, because you aren't trying to automate trust, you're trying to protect it. The business effect of this shift is direct. You get fewer revision loops and faster decision paths. You see better handoffs between regions and less false alignment at the start of projects. Trust improves because your team stops pretending the first draft of understanding is good enough. That's the shift firms need in 2026. Some organizations will keep collecting cleaner records of confused meetings, but others will use these tools to recover intent before confusion turns into a cost. The software won't be the difference. The meeting model will, so make this concrete in the very next multilingual meeting you run. Translation removes friction, but understanding only improves when you treat the recap as a signal that still needs human judgment. In your next multilingual meeting, check the recap for vague ownership and missing authority. Send one follow-up that tests the meaning instead of just repeating the notes. If this changed how you think, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. Connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn and tell me where global collaboration is breaking in your organization, because that's where the next episode should start.